What's their full name?
Paul Kerchum. No middle initial.
Really? Okay. And your date of birth?
25 January 1920.
Okay. And where did you grow up?
I was born in Youngstown, Ohio, and when I was 6 years old, my family moved to McKees Rocks, Pennsylvania, right across the river from Pittsburgh, across the Ohio River, McKees Rock, and I lived there till I was 18 when I enlisted in the Army.
And so that brings us pretty quickly to your enlistment. How did that take place?
Well, my first enlistment was with E Company, 27th Infantry, Hawaii. After my foreign service tour was over, I re-enlisted and joined B Company, 31st Infantry, in the old Spanish Wall City, Manila, September 1940.
Well, before the war started for America.
What was that again?
That was well before the war started.
Yeah, it was 16 months there before the war started. Yeah.
What did you do during that time?
During the peacetime?
Mm-hmm.
Trying to stay out of trouble, which was pretty hard to do because I got into trouble a couple of times. I got demoted twice, and in fact, right before the war started, we were in Manila one evening with a whole group from my company, and there was a couple of Japanese young fellows there at the door, and I was the only one that noticed them, but they were giving us the figure, you know. So I took off after them. They jumped into a cab, and I flew after them, and we were struggling out of beating each other on the ground. And the MP family came along. They're always right around the corner, and naturally,
You got in trouble.
yeah. Anyway, that was about a week or two before the war started, and I was telling one of my friends, I said, well, the company commander had me up for a court-martial, and I said, the only thing that's going to save me is the war. Sure enough, we're down in the sunken gardens outside of Manila. A runner came up and said, they want you at headquarters. I went up, and they said, we decided to not to press charges, you know. Here I'm fighting with two Japanese and not going to press charges. 6 months before the war started, we received the M1 Garand rifle. Well, the 31st and the Philippine Scouts, because we were all part of the same division. And also, about a month before the war started, we received a 31 millimeter mortar, but the ammunition ended up in Australia. So all we had was the old World War I 81 millimeter mortar, and we ran out of ammunition for that one before long.
You were there in Manila.
Mm-hmm.
How did you find out?
Well, it was Sunday in Manila, while it was Saturday at Pearl Harbor, you know,
Yeah.
and Sunday morning, all of a sudden we heard an aircraft. Everybody ran out of their barracks, and some sergeants were shooting pistols aircraft that were about 13,000 feet up there, and it was hilarious in a way, you know. And that's what we knew that they were attacking us, because that's when they destroyed the B-17s at Clark Field, P-40s at Nielsen, and the other airfield there.
Yeah. Wow. And so pretty quickly I suppose you got some orders to do something. Where were you required to go from there?
From there, well, the first plan for the defense of the Philippines was to meet the enemy at the logical landing points on northern and southern Luzon. And the landings were so swift and actually unexpected. Plan was discarded, and Plan Orange was put into effect. This plan called for all the troops to pour into Bataan, hold out for 6 months, when help would arrive. And the plan worked pretty well with some exceptions. One, 25,000 Philippine civilians, men, women, and children, poured into Bataan, and they had to be fed. Number two, somebody forgot to bring the food.
Yeah.
And a lot of people say, well, it was lack of ammunition that led to the downfall. No, it was a lack of food, from my estimation, that led to the downfall of Bataan. I never ran out of ammunition. I ran out of food.
Oh, yeah. And from there, what happened next?
Well, after 93 days of fighting on Bataan, Colonel King, who was the commander of the troops on Bataan, after much soul searching, he knew that help was not coming from the United States. He knew the poor condition of his army, and he knew that General Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, and the conqueror of Singapore the previous February had just arrived in the Philippines with additional troops. And so then he decided, in order to stay further lives, to surrender the forces of Bataan.
Okay.
And on April 1941, he met with Japanese Colonel of Operations to lay the groundwork for the surrender. And the Japanese colonel insisted nothing but unconditional surrender. So the next morning, April 9th, General King met with the Japanese High Command and officially surrendered the army on Bataan. It was a hungry, disease-ridden army suffering from malaria, dysentery, malnutrition, and other diseases. And the men were not ready for that which followed the Bataan Death March.
Can you go into some detail on that?
Well, let's see. I think between 45 and 55 miles from Marvelis to the San Fernando railhead was the death march. Men were shot, bayoneted, beheaded, or beaten to death for no reason whatsoever. At the San Fernando railhead, they were stuffed into boxcars. Doors were closed and locked. After a 4-hour freight ride, they were offloaded at the village of Capas. Then they were offloaded there on an 8-kilometer hike to the first prison camp. Was it O'Donnell? Camp O'Donnell? Yeah, Camp O'Donnell. And as each group entered O'Donnell, they were greeted by a Japanese lieutenant who screamed and yelled at them, calling them capitalistic pigs and other words of endearment. I'll never forget his last words. He said, "You are not prisoners of war, you are captives, and you're going to be treated like captives." And for the next 2 months, 1,500 Americans and several thousand Philippine soldiers died at Camp O'Donnell.
What were some of the...
You want to continue on?
What were some of the conditions that...
Well, it was a former Philippine Army barracks, and naturally, when the Philippine Army left, the civilians had ransacked everything, you know, and everything was in disorder. The water, it took several days to get the water turned on and everything, and things were pretty, well, the men were in bad shape, you know, after the march, you know, and they had what they called the zero ward, and when you passed out or something, you were transported to zero ward, where eventually you died, you know. And I remember at that time, a friend of mine, well, I was in there a couple of days, a friend of mine from my hometown came through, and he had little chocolates, little sugar candies that the Filipinos were throwing out to them. So he gave me just a little bit, and that night my stomach was hurting terrible, and I passed out. And I woke up in the morning, and the guy said, "Boy, you're lucky. They were just getting ready to take you to the zero ward, you know." And I said, "What happened to my friend?" They said, "He ended up in the zero ward. He ate, I guess because he ate the whole chocolate, you know." I was lucky, yeah.
Yeah. How long were you there?
Until June of 1942, when we were transferred to the main prison camp, Cabanatuan 1. And there we met up with the men from Corregidor. The men from Corregidor didn't have a death march. They were ferried across Manila Bay, marched through the streets of Manila, and transported to Cabanatuan 1. When we got there, they were pretty well entrenched and had everything pretty well organized. However, most of the people from Bataan ended up on the hospital side. And let's see. The things were pretty rough on the hospital side. People were dying right and left, 30 and 40 a day. And 3,000 died at the hospital side during the next 6 months. And they were taken to the burial areas, to 30 and 40 a day for quite a while. And I ended up on a work detail on the hospital side, on a 45-man work detail on the hospital side until July of 1943, when I was transferred to the main side. And early in October 1943, I was in the meantime, work details were sent out from Corregidor, from Bataan 1 to the Airfields, Corregidor, and other areas to salvage material for the Japanese war effort. Also, details were sent to were sent overseas to Taiwan, Japan, and Manchuria on work details. 5,200 Americans went down to the bottom of the sea when they were on these ships taking them to those destinations, and they were called the hell ships. Anyway, October 1943, I was on a 500-man work detail sent to the area near the village of Las Piñas, about 40 miles from Manila. There, for the next year, we built an airfield, complete with runways, drainage ditches, and revetments for the storage of aircraft. I remember when we first got there, we had a Japanese civilian. He was built like a proverbial brick, you know, and he carried a pick handle. So when we first got out and tore down the dikes on the rice field, and he came out one day and he talked to the interpreter. The interpreter wanted to know if anybody had surveying experience. Well, I looked at the picks and shovels and everything. Yeah, I want. So for 2 weeks I'm walking around like a big shot, you know. I had 2 thieves and a couple of assistants. One day he came over, got on his knees, looked down, and the damn runway was going like that. He talked to the interpreter, came over, and he whacked me on his knee with that pick handle. And that's what I'm suffering to this day. needless to say, I never put surveying on my list, you know.
Not on your resume.
Anyway, we worked there for 1 year. October 1944, we were working at the end of the runway when one of the men began yelling and pointing towards Manila. And there above the sky of Manila, hundreds of aircraft, American and Japanese, in aerial combat. Later on, we learned that this was about the time that General MacArthur was landing on the Philippine island of Leyte. And next morning, 1,100 of us were poured into the forward and the aft holds of the Japanese ship, the Harold Maru. Our ship was part of a 9-ship convoy with the Japanese families and other people on board on the way to Japan. We no sooner left Manila Bay and we came under Japanese American submarine attack. The holds were covered, and what seemed like endless days, all we heard were the detonating depth charges from the Japanese destroyers. And this went on and on. 18 horrendous days and nights running all over the South China Sea, being chased by American submarines. On the 18th day, we pulled into Hong Kong. When we docked, I happened to be by the ladder. Japanese guard motioned for 2 men to come to topside. I scrambled up the ladder, grabbed the water hose, drank and drenched myself, drank some more. Then I started filling water bottles and canteens as they were sent up from the hold. This went on for about 3 or 4 hours when finally air raid sirens went off. Here comes American aircraft, some more in China, looking for targets of opportunity. Back down in the hold and away we went again. 7 days later, we pulled into Taiwan. We were there about 2 weeks when we were loaded on to the Australian cruise ship, the Melbourne Maru, which the Japanese had confiscated at the beginning of the war. And they put 300 British soldiers on the ship with us. And you know what the British soldiers' favorite pastime was? Singing. They sang and they sang day and night. I barely remember one of the songs. It went something like this. The cruise ship was leaving Bombay, heavily laden with time-expired men, bound for the land they adore. There will be no promotion this side of the ocean, so cheer up, my lads, bless them all, the long, the short, and the tall, and on and on and on. Anyway, after 7 days, without any incidents, we pulled into the Japanese port of Moji on the northern tip of Kyushu, the second largest island in the Japanese archipelago. At that time, there wasn't a tunnel underneath the strait to connecting Kyushu with the large Japanese island of let's see. I keep thinking of Luzon, the Philippine one. Oh, Honshu, the largest Japanese island in the Japanese archipelago. Anyway, we were stuffed into a train, standing room only, and off we went, headed north. Now this was around November 1944, and American planes were bombing everything in sight, including the railroads. Every once in a while, the train would stop while the railroad was being repaired. Eventually, we reached the port city of Sendai. Now, this is the city that about 6 or 7 months ago that was hit with a earthquake and a tsunami. Anyway, we were offloaded there, and we were put on a narrow gauge railroad and headed north. There was no road up to the village of Hostakura, a mining town, but the only way up there was this narrow gauge railroad. And I'm making a point of this because it was bombed by the American aircraft right before the war ended, and we had to stay there for 30 or 40 days while the railroad was being repaired before we went back down. Anyway, we got up to the Hasakura, and there we worked at Mitsubishi Mine number 11 until the end of the war.
I'm out of breath just listening. That's a lot. That was you arrived there. What was the date you arrived there? Do you remember?
What date?
Yeah.
Well, like I said, it was around the end of November 1944.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah, because I figured the time frame, you know, so pretty close to the end of November. Yeah.
Can you tell me about when the war was over and
Okay.
what happened then
Well,
with you guys?
let's see. About a week or so before the war ended, a B-29 came over and knocked the railroad out and knocked the smelter out and a few other buildings around the area. That was about a week before the war ended. And I remember not too long after that, normally they would march us down to the mine about 6 o'clock in the morning. So one morning, 6 o'clock came, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock. Then they marched us down to the main tunnel. And while we were in the tunnel, they put machine guns on both ends of our people. And the Japanese lieutenant was on the radio to Tokyo. And he talked for a while. Finally, he marched us back up the hill. Later on, we realized what the Japanese had done, like at Taliban, they're killing the Americans and everything. That we would have been shot, you know. But next thing we know, the Japanese guards all disappeared except the Japanese lieutenant, you know. And the first thing one of the guys did, they grabbed his sword and threw it down the latrine. And then B-29s came over and dropped food, clothing, medicine, everything. So for the next 30 days, you know, we were no longer the 75-pound POWs. We put on a little bit of weight, you know, and when the railroad was finished, we went down. They put us on a hospital ship and gave us the usual shots, a shower, clean clothes, and everything. Next day, put us on a British destroyer. So off we went, headed south. So after a few days, we entered Tokyo Bay, the most beautiful sight in the world. Battleship after battleship, cruiser after cruiser, destroyers, and every conceivable type of naval aircraft in that harbor, you know. Well, they put us into a former Japanese airfield, Itsugi Airfield. And then we were debriefed by American intelligence. And after debriefing, put us on a B-24. And I remember when we got on to B-24, we started to put the parachutes on, and the crew chief said, I wouldn't do that. He said, they haven't been inspected in 3 years. You know, thanks a lot. Anyway, we landed in Okinawa, and they put us in tents, and that night the typhoon hit, the tents blew away, and we're running around like naked jaybirds, you know. After a week or so, order was restored, put us in another B-24, and we headed south. And you wouldn't guess where we landed. The airfield that we built for the Japanese. Anyway, it was now a replacement depot. So we stayed there for about a week or 10 days, I forget. And the nurses kept asking us when we want to go back home, you know. And after about a week or so, I said, hell, I'm ready, you know. So they put me on a slow ship, you know, and finally I got to San Francisco and ended up in Letterman General Hospital for a week or so, more shots and everything. Finally put on a slow train and then ended up in let's see, Warrenton, I think it was Warrenton, Virginia, Woodrow Wilson General Hospital. And I remember there were quite a few of us ended up there at the hospital, and we were running around, and we weren't paying attention to anything. Every night we'd climb over the wall to the nearest saloon, and MPs finally would round us up and bring us back. So one day a nurse came over and said, "You men are supposed to be in room 16. So we went over, we peeked around the corner, and the guys were weaving baskets. That night we jumped over the fence again to the nearest saloon. We never wove any baskets. Anyway, after I was there for a few weeks, finally put on a train, ended up in a little town, Pennsylvania. I think it was the replacement depot, and I was discharged, and I headed for home. I was home just a few weeks, and I never got my family wasn't really a real family. What do you call those families? What's the name for them?
Dysfunctional?
Dysfunctional. Everybody went their own way, you know. And after a few weeks, I went to Fort Meade, Maryland. I hitchhiked to Fort Meade, Maryland, and re-enlisted. Re-enlisted for the Air Force. Ended up in Marshfield, California.
That's fascinating. Fascinating story.
If we talk about a dysfunctional family, both of my parents drank a lot, and when I was discharged, and I got paid off, I said, I certainly am supposed to get more. And they said, "Oh, I forgot to tell you, your parents took out an allotment while you were in prison camp." And of course, they drank it all up.
Yeah. Goodness.
Yeah.
Not what you want to hear. So you end up in California.
In Marshfield, yeah.
And you were telling us, a little while earlier about meeting your wife.
Oh, yeah.
Can you tell that story again?
Yeah. Well, anyway,
California?
yeah, we re-enlisted into the U.S. Army Air Force station in Marshfield. And we were basket cases, probably suffering PTSD, which was unknown at the time. And we broke every rule and regulation at the base, and even some of the laws at the local city of Riverside. And eventually, I guess most of us were busted down to private. I was reduced from staff sergeant to private. And in order to make a little extra money, I decided to work at the local beer garden on the base. And every evening about 4 o'clock, this young 18-year-old, good-looking lady would come prancing through the beer garden on her way home. And everybody, I thought they were going to go blind, craning their heads, you know. She was a good-looking lady. Anyway, one day they sent her over to get some food out of a walk-in freezer. Gloria walked in, I walked in behind her, shut the door, and love in the freezer began. And it wasn't long afterwards that we became married, and we were married for 74 years. She passed away last December 21, she was 91 years old. Yeah.
Wonderful story. Yeah, that's a wonderful story. After that, well, how How many children do you have? Tell me about your family.
Just Paul and Paul.
Okay.
And Paul was in the 1970s, the typical guy, drugs and all that, you know, and despite everything we tried to help him, no, he finally passed away, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but Paul, she lives up the hill here. Like I said, I was in real estate for over 30 years, working out of my office. First, we moved out here. There was an old house over on that side. We lived in it for 10 years, and I ran my real estate company out of that house. And when we built this one, I continued to run the real estate, and there was my desk and everything. And across the road there was a development by a man by the name of Warren. Anytime there's water with a development like Twin Lakes in Wilcox, or Mescal Lakes, or Ocarino Lakes, it was a bad outfit. And what they would do, they sell so many lots, they'd cut the water off, and they'd proceed on further on. Anyway, finally, they closed, they cut the water off, and the two lakes became dry, and off they went. So one day there was a knock on the door, and the gentleman, to me, I can tell a Japanese a mile away. He was Japanese, but he was well dressed and everything, and he says, I'm a vice president of our company in Illinois, in Chicago, and he said, somebody loaded that lemon across the road, and we don't know what to do with it. He says, what do you think it's worth? I said, sir, absolutely worthless, you know. Anyway, a few weeks went by, and he come knocked on the door again. He said, I'm going to make you an offer you can't refuse. And I took the offer, you know. So the subdivision was in 5 units, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. First unit was the closest one to the interstate, you know. So I sold it off first, and most of it was commercial. But the biggest sale was there was a WWII trailer on 8 acres with a water well, and utilities were all connected, and that's what they use it to get the people to try to sell them the real. So, well, I bought that immediately for $5,000 and sold it for $55,000, and then I was on my way. And it got to the point. One day, a lady from Sierra Vista called me. She was in real estate, and she says, I'm interested in one of your lots, you know. And I said, well, I'll send you the information, you know. And she says, well, why don't you fax me? I said, what? You know? She says, yes. She says, if you don't know what fax is, she says, you'll never make $1 million. I says, lady, I already sold my first $1 million, you know. And right away I could see the handwriting on the wall. Everything turned out to be computerized. So a couple of days later, I sold my company, you know. And well, I was 90% disabled, and then it said once you become, you can't work, you'll get the other 10%. So I sold my company and it couldn't work, and I got the other 10%.
You're a smart man.
Did start showing up in force. Were you then worried about, like, I've been worried about getting killed by the Japanese, now I'm worried about getting killed by the Americans.
Well, that's what happened, you know. Fortunately, the commandant, the Japanese commandant, was on that radio with Tokyo, and they said the war's over. Otherwise, we would have had it, you know. In Palomar, there were 200 Americans. They put them in a ditch and machine gunned them. And then they set them on fire.
What is, if there is one thing, what is the worst thing that you saw or experienced?
Well, I guess when we got to when we got to Camp O'Donnell, the first thing, that's when it finally dawned on me, that I'm a prisoner of war, and after all what after 1,500 Americans and several thousand Filipino soldiers died, it dawned on me what's ahead, And of course, it got worse when we hit the main camp. They better come on, because the people kept dying there on the hospital side, Yeah. And it was horrendous when we first got there. It was the monsoon season. The outside latrines were overflowing and stuff laying all over, and you had to walk from the barracks, And finally, it dawned on the people on the main camp that we needed help, So they finally sent work details over, and made new latrines and put boardwalks, towards them, and things got a little bit civilized. Yeah. But until then, people just kept dying,
You talked about PTSD, that you guys had it and nobody knew.
No.
Explain what that was like. Were you running from it? Were you reliving everything? How was it for you carrying all those experiences?
I don't know. I guess God gave me a brain. But, I don't know. And my wife, Gloria, if it wasn't for her, I would have never made it. Truthfully, A lot of the guys' wives left them, They left them, yeah.
Because you couldn't talk about it then, or you didn't.
Yeah.
Why is that? Your generation, the guys were so tough, they just held everything in.
Well, when I was first growing up during the Great Depression, I remember during the early 1930s, I had a little wagon, and I used to go up in the rich neighborhoods through the alleys, finding whiskey bottles that I turned in for money, and anything that I could take to the salvage yard and make a little bit of money. I was the only one in the family making any money. My father was out of work, and I said, I struggled, and I remember when I first started going to school, I was in a sixth or seventh grade, I forget. And anyway, the schools in the area had competition once a month, and each school would send a representative for geography or civics or something. And the geography teacher always picked me, and I always won, And so one day the civics teacher came and says, Paul, how would you like to represent me one time? I said, well, I'd like to, but see, I got this little wagon, and in the evenings after school, I told her, and she said, well, how much do you usually make in an evening? I usually made about a quarter or so. I said, 50 cents. So she said, here's 2 quarters. So I represented her and I won. But I say, this is what you had. You had a scrounge, You had a scrounge.
How would you describe World War II in your own words?
Well, in the first place, outside of the Garand rifle that we received 6 months before the war, the division was the 3 Philippine Count regiment, and the 31st was the Philippine division, and we all received it. And that was a big help, and of course we received a 60 millimeter mortar right before the war started. The ammunition ended up in Australia, and the Japanese mortars just gave us holy hell. I remember I had the machine gun squad, and after 13 days of fighting on that Bataan at the hacienda, Abukai hacienda, 13th day we were told to pull out into reserve position, and we were just gathering everything around, and the mortar shell ended up not too far from me, Japanese mortar shell. Knocked me flat on my face. My helmet was completely destroyed. And the next thing I know, a couple of hours later, I'm walking along with two guys who were helping me along, you know. And I never ended up in the hospital. But there was a lot of helmets laying around. I got another helmet.
Were any of the Japanese helpful to you guys, or were they all absolutely enemies?
Well, there were two instances where, well, maybe two or three instances where I met a Japanese. When I was in Combat One, I ended up on a litter detail, with me and another guy, carrying oranges to the Japanese kitchen. So one time he said, stop, halt, take a rest, you know. And he looked away, and I had a straw hat. I grabbed 3 oranges, put them in my hat, you know, and we started walking away. I was too damn greedy, you know. My straw hat kept rolling around, and he kept eyeing me. Finally, halto, you know, took my hat off, put 2 of them back, put one in my hat back again, you know, whacked me on the butt. And normally I could have been killed, because one of the regulations in the camp was stealing. You can be beaten to death or even shot, you know. So that was one of the times. I think there was some. Oh, another time when the General King decided to surrender the army on April 9th, that evening, Captain Thompson, our company commander, with the few of us that were left, gathered around, and he says, they're going to surrender in the morning. And he said, as far as I'm concerned, you guys are all on your own, you know. So anyway, a guy by the name of Hicks and he had the other machine gun squad. We took off together, and dark, no stars, no moon, dark, as you couldn't see your head inside it. So we're walking down along, pretty soon we hear a horrible root out of the trail. And here's a dump truck with a bunch of Filipinos around it. And he says, every time they load us, he puts it in the gear, and they throws us out. And he says, oh hell, I know how to drive that thing. So he loaded them up, he got it, he started, wham, off they all took off. So anyway, we started going down that jungle trail, you know, and finally we almost bumped into 2 lines of Japanese, and they were down with their rifles, you know, and we were eyeballing each other. Evidently, they were told not to do anything because they were going to surrender in the morning, so we backed off. Took down another trail, you know, roamed around all night, ended up practically the same damn place we took off. But anyway, a little further off though. Anyway, the next day we took off down another trail, you know. We kept going through Bataan there. And finally we stumbled into a Japanese camp. And there was several trucks there, and there were a whole bunch of boxes and everything. Quartermaster, Japanese quartermaster, you know. And when we got there, we started to talk to them. One of them spoke some English, you know, and we were talking to them. They fed us, you know, me and Hicks, you know. And let's see, it was pretty soon. It was morning. They loaded us up into one of the trucks and put the camels down, and they went. See, these were quartermaster ones, not the Japanese. If they were soldiers, we'd have been dead. So there was some good Japanese that we met there. And I think there was maybe another one.
Overall, how did they treat you?
Well, what they did is they let the Americans govern themselves in the camps, you know. They had their own cooks and everything, and the Americans learned how to cook the rice in these big caldrons, you know, and they more or less left us on our own, you know, and Americans ruled the camps, you know. And what they did, they put them in groups of 10, and there was a note made of it, you know, how many people belong in every group. And if one of that group escaped, they would shoot the other 9. I remember talking to a guy by the name of Lewis. He is from Albuquerque when we first formed the 31st Infantry Association, and he had a brother that was on Bataan in a work detail, and one of the men and his brother's group escaped, and he watched his brother getting shot.
I could talk to you for days, but let me ask you this. You go to visit schools, you do talks, people want to hear your story.
Yeah,
Many, many, many years from now,
yeah.
how would you like people to remember you as Paul Kerchum?
Well, the people in the Benton area remember me because for 20 years they heard me as the keynote speaker at every memorial and Veterans Day. And also, there's people in the area in these camps, you know, in these people, winter visitor camps, you know. They invited me to give a talk at their places, you know. And pretty soon people.
But I mean, overall, people would look at you as an American hero, as a World War II hero.
Yeah.
Do you feel that way?
I think I deserve it. I ate enough of rice to prove it.
Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. You're one of a kind. All right.